Hi, this is Susan from Grief Heals. And today I wanted to talk about loneliness. And the reason I'm talking about loneliness is because um, last fall I ran a survey, and loneliness was oh, one of the top two topics. The other was anger, regret, and guilt. I've already done a class on that. and I will be running that again. It was a huge success. Yay! So, but loneliness was on that list. And it is something that plagues grieving spouses almost from the beginning. In the beginning, it's the yearning for the spouse who's died. But as as life unfolds over the months, it's just there's this emptiness, and loneliness is part of it, big part of it. And the problem with loneliness is it also tends to be one of those things that lingers long past active grief. And um, and so it's really problematic. But what I wanted to talk about today, what I've been thinking about, which I just found was so interesting, not surprising, really, just interesting, that when I raised this topic of loneliness and how spouses feel lonely, they all immediately went to dating. And yeah, we'll talk about dating. We'll talk about that. But dating is something that you address down the line a little bit. You don't go from being a grieving spouse to just jumping into another relationship or starting to date or getting on Tinder and that stuff. You just don't. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. I haven't seen it work for anybody. Seen tried, but I haven't seen it work. So there are things that have to happen in between the the death of your spouse and the grief that you're experiencing now, and getting to a point where you're even remotely ready to date. And that really involves figuring out who you are now, which also means looking back at who you were, who you still are, and things that may have changed in terms of yourself. Because one of the things that died along with your spouse was your sense of self, where it took a big hit. So that's a huge piece. Looking at what your relationship was like with your spouse is another piece. Looking at um, what you really want your life to look like. You take your wanting your spouse back out of the picture and really look at what you would like going forward. Figuring out how to identify that is important, because it might not be you want you may not want another relationship. And I have to say, many of the people in my groups are taking that stance, and they are second half of the first year into the second year for the most part right now, and they're not interested in dating, most of them. So, but that could change. That could change 3 or 4 years down the line. It could definitely change. So, there's the figure out who you are, who how your spouse is being integrated into your life, what you want your life to look like, where are your interests now? What are your interests? You have all kinds of possibilities now. And what are they? And looking at those and experimenting some and figuring out how you want to be spending your time, assuming that you are no longer working. If you're still working, that's somewhat limited, but this principle still applies. So that figuring out what's really essential for your happiness. I'm not sure you could even tell me. I had a long, long list of things that I thought I really needed, and in fact, I only needed two. I needed a dog and I needed a house in the country. Those are my two. And I identified those back around the year 2000, and I had both of them by 2005. So actually sooner than that. Actually sooner than that. So at any rate, identifying what you really want, what's essential for your happiness, and figuring out how to have that. And then the rest is gravy. It's not to say you don't want other things, you're just not, they're not as essential. So there's that. And once you have that and you have put it all together and created a life for yourself that feels good, that feels meaningful, that feels like it has a purpose, might even be moments of joy, it is possible that you reach that point where one of two things is going to happen. You're going to be so happy, you're going to be so happy that you don't care whether you have another relationship or not. Or the perfect person is just going to kind of waltz right into your life and be the perfect partner. But you wouldn't get there. You won't get there in all probability. Yeah, things happen, good things happen, and you could kind of short circuit all of this. But you really taking the time to figure out who you are, what you want, what activities you want to be engaged in, what's really essential for your happiness. These are the things that make loneliness a non-issue. It makes it easier to make friends, makes it easier to date, makes it easier to get into another relationship if that's what you want. And all of those things become easier when you know all of that. So this summer, I'm going to be walking people through that. I think it's going to end up 6 weeks because it's a lot to cover. But you'll get the tools to keep working with these things. It's not like you're going to have it all settled in 6 weeks, but you will have the tools. You will understand what needs to be in place. You'll understand where your work is and all of that. So if you're interested, get on my mailing list. There's a link in the description. I'm starting to write emails, background emails on this topic, and I'll be writing them for the next month or so. And then we'll have a class. And so that's it. You take care. Bye-bye.